Well, welcome to the Kingdom Within, week one. So I wanted to start with a little herald, a call to action. I came across this quote recently from Hippocrates. Don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's the one that came up with that oath that all the doctors take, which is, if you are not your own doctor, you are a fool. And I was struck by that because I've had not had any major medical issues, but I have had some experiences with doctors in the hospital system. And yes, this feels very true that even though you want to rely on expertise from the experts to totally outsource the responsibility and the authority of your physical well-being to someone else is very foolish. And I think that's also true for our spiritual health. Obviously, spiritual authorities are very valuable. We all have them, we all need them. But in some sense, if you're not your own pastor, priest, rabbi, guru, scripture, practice, technique, there's more opportunity for ownership, for leadership, and for responsibility. Because ultimately, each of us are on our own individual journey, climbing our own mountain that's unique to us. Um, as we go through tonight, as we go through the course, things that I'm saying are going to bring up different memories for different people, different associations. And so it really is an individual journey, this life thing we're doing. And I think that's how we find God. I love this quote. God comes to us disguised as our life. I think that's really well said. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the narrow gate, entering through the narrow gate. And I think that, each of us in our life have the narrow gate, and that taking that narrow path, um, it's an individual shaped path, and it's unique to each one of us. And our nature is to take that path and um, to grow through the unique challenges that life presents to each one of us. So I wanted to share this quote from the Tao Te Ching. This really encapsulates my path well and a lot of the point of view I'm bringing to this course. So it goes, when they lose their sense of awe, people turn to religion. When they no longer trust themselves, they begin to depend upon authority. And that was very much true for me. I grew up in a evangelical, very religious household, which I loved. But at some point in my 20s, I had really lost that sense of awe, and had outsourced so much of my authority to these external references. And that presented a challenge. So in the course, we're going to try to do our best to balance the Christian tradition, wisdom traditions, secondary sources with this motivation to be our own doctors and to really take ownership for ourselves. Um, Again, because each of us is, even if we're climbing the same mountain, each of us is having a different journey. So in this course, what I'm trying to do here is share the maps that have worked really well for me of the interior landscape, and some maps of my own. And hopefully that will be of value as you walk on your journey. Okay, so let's move on to the introduction. So course introduction. The thesis, the hypothesis of the course is that God is everywhere, everywhere. And in the Christian tradition, we have this doctrine, the omnipresence of God. I'm sure we've all heard this before. And so that means that God is everywhere, everywhere you look, whether you're out in the woods, God is in everyone, with everyone. God is throughout the entire cosmos. It's entirely saturated with God's presence. And so that's the good news. The good news is, you can't miss it. If you're looking for God, you can't miss it. And that's the course. Just kidding. Because the reality is we often feel separate from God. And most of us, all of us at some time, maybe most of the time, feel that God is not nearby. And we wish we had more presence of God in our lives. We wish we had more of that peace that passes understanding, unconditional love, freedom from anxiety, that God brings. And so the paradox of God is everywhere, you can't miss him, and God feels separate from me. That's the paradox that we're going to be exploring over these 7 weeks in this course. Okay, so the course curriculum. So week 1, we're going to be looking at my story as sort of a case study. Growing up in the church, I always really enjoyed hearing people's testimonies and their stories of what God had done directly and personally in their own lives. Um, so I want to share that with you all tonight as a way of giving you context on where I'm coming from and the way that God has met me in my life. And then next week, week 2, we'll look at the human condition from a developmental standpoint. So what can we learn about the human condition from the stages of life, from a baby to a child to an adult and beyond? Week 3, we're going to really drill in on what mindfulness is and how it relates to the gospel and what Jesus was teaching about the kingdom of heaven, which is the main theme of his teachings in the gospels. Week 4, we're going to focus in on thought and thinking, which causes us to mistake who we are. And there will be more about that in week 4. This is something that, from my understanding, is really unique to the Eastern traditions, specifically Buddhism, and how they approach thought is just really advanced. And I don't think there's anything really like it in the West. I think the West is actually particularly confused about what thinking is and what thought is. Week 5, we're going to look at attention versus awareness. These are two different modes of being, and they're very different. Then week 6, we'll dive into feelings and emotions, and look at them through the lens of internal family systems, IFS, which is a therapy mode that I've really found to be valuable and has helped me to make sense of a lot of spiritual dynamics inside that are named in the Bible, but IFS is just a really exquisite way to look at them. And then week 7, hopefully, will be the most fun, I think, looking at salvation, evolution, and the future of the cosmos. Based on everything we've learned to this point, what are we doing here and what might the future look like? And then just a last bit of housekeeping. So we've got our weekly meeting on Wednesday nights where the emphasis is going to be really on theory and understanding, with some introduction to practice at the end of the session. And then the goal is that throughout the week, everyone is continuing to repeat those practices and really integrate the lesson from that week. That's how you're going to get the most benefit from the course. And lastly, I just want to say I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. That's somehow the mystery of this is there isn't something that I have that you don't, or vice versa. Um, Accessing the presence of God is a very individual, personal thing. And my hope is to just share how that's worked for me and hopes that it's helpful for you. Okay. So let's dive into my case study. And actually, before we do, I'm curious if you could hit the raise hand thing if you grew up in an evangelical household, if you know what that is and you identify in that way. We've got one. I saw another one, two. Okay, well, I thought there would be more. We got 3, 4. Okay, maybe there are more. Well, if you are from that hopefully this will resonate. And if not, you'll get a window into that world. So should be fun. So starting out, so this is a little mood board from my experience growing up. On the left corner is my church in Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania. I lived there till I was 10, and my family was really active in our church community. And then in fifth grade, we moved to Vermont and joined a different church that had a Christian school in the back. So I went to the Christian school attached to our church from fifth grade to 12th grade. And growing up, it was a lot of the Bible. There was a lot of Bible stories, Sunday school, children's church, a lot of flannel graphs, learning all the Old Testament stories, the New Testament stories. And my family was really devoted to it. My mom had grown up Lutheran, my dad grew up Catholic. Neither one of them really clicked with that. And in their 20s found born again Christianity. And that really was a turning point for them, and they committed their lives to it. So we weren't allowed to listen to worldly music. So we loved Christian contemporary music like the Newsboys. Um, wore our WWJD bracelets from the 90s, and I think these are actually making a comeback with Gen Z bringing everything back from the 90s. And our lives really revolved around Jesus and the death on the cross and resurrection. That was really the center point of reality. And yeah, again, between church and family devotions, the whole nine yards, by the time I was probably like 5 or 6 in this photo, I had a really good understanding of what we believed and what the worldview was. And I want to briefly walk through it just so you have a sense of where my head was at as a youngster. So this is how I understood it, that in the beginning, God created the whole universe and it was good. And God created all the animals and Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve were the first humans, and they were my distant relatives. All the humans had come from Adam and Eve. Um, and they had it made. They had it made in the shade. They had free food, no worries, and they got to hang out with God all the time. Genesis gives us this picture that God was really present and intimate and kind of a regular presence in the Garden of Eden. So creation was unified. There was just this unity, and there was no separation. And then the plot thickens. We have this talking serpent. He approaches Eve on her own. And oh, there was one stipulation. I forgot. There was this tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God told Adam and Eve, don't eat from this tree. And if you do, you'll die. So the snake comes by, talks to Eve, says, hey, why don't you eat from this tree? Looks pretty good. And Eve says, no, I can't, I'll die. And the serpent says, well, you won't die. Um, you'll actually become like God. And that's what God doesn't want, because then you won't need him anymore. You'll be autonomous. You will know good and evil, and you will be like God. And so I think Eve felt some truth in that. And so she takes and eats from the fruit. Adam does as well. And they unlock this capacity to know good from evil. And in the same moment, they created separation by this grab for autonomy. This isn't exactly how I understood it as a 5-year-old, but they disobeyed God. And so they're evicted and they're separated from God. They're now sinners and they're thrown out of paradise. And the really bad news is because they're my great, 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 great grandmother and grandfather, I'm participating in the same thing. So, as soon as I show up on the scene in 1989, I'm already separate from God. I didn't eat the apple, but I'm paying for their sins. Ever heard of it? Um, and so we all have this sin nature. We used to be good. When God's creation started out, it was good, but now it's bad and it's been cursed. Um, and although nobody in my church called me public enemy number one. There was really this sense of being a dirty, rotten, filthy sinner. Um, that our identity fundamentally was bad. And because of this sin nature, we were separated from God. And if that wasn't bad enough, your default position was to be headed on a one-way ticket to hell, which was God's torture chamber in the basement of the universe, um, where you would be on fire forever. Your flesh would be literally aflame for eternity. And like we all have these ideas of hell. Hell really freaked me out as a kid. It really traumatized me. Um, but somehow we all have these same ideas of what hell is from the cartoons. And I just want to flag that for me now, I don't see hell this way. I think this view of hell is really a misunderstanding of what Jesus taught. Um, but that's another story. So I was really afraid to go to hell. So it was just a bad situation. I'm a sinner and I'm separated from God and I'm going to hell. But thankfully, God had mercy on me and came down to earth in the form of his son Jesus. And Jesus' death on the cross serves as a human sacrifice for my sins. And by trusting in Jesus as my Savior, inviting him into my heart, and asking him to forgive my sins, that enables me to bridge this separation with God and restore what had been lost. So, I mean, as a kid, I loved God, I loved Jesus, and I invited him into my heart, and I loved it. But I did worry about my friends on the soccer team and at school because I knew most of them were going to be burning in hell for eternity. Um, and at first grade, I brought two people to the Lord. I brought two of my friends to the Lord. But after that, I really couldn't overcome the social anxiety of soul winning. So my count is still at two. I'll let you know if it changes. And this, what I just explained, is really like the theme of my life growing up, from age 0 to 22. That whole narrative was my bedrock and the foundation upon which I understood the world. And I'm like joking a little bit, making fun of it a little bit, but I really do appreciate it. And I'm really thankful for um, growing up in such rich communities and all the people that invested in me. And I still have so many blessings because of the way I was brought up, and really grateful for that. But I do think there's some fundamental flaws in it. And I think this meme does a good job of explaining what that was. So here we have Jesus knocking on the door of the heart saying, "Let me in." Why? So I can save you. From what? From what I'm going to do to you if you don't let me in. And this, I just think, points out a fundamental contradiction in the gospel narrative as I've laid it out. And I call it the doom loop of sin nature. And my personal opinion is that the whole sin nature thing is a real problem. Um, and interesting to note, sin nature never took on as a doctrine in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's just the West that believed this. It really originates with Augustine. Um, Sin nature is not really even in the Bible. It's a very thin case to be made. And this is how it worked for me. So I start out, my identity is a dirty, rotten, filthy sinner that God still loves, thankfully. He has mercy. And through his mercy, I'm able to have an identity change to be saved, really as a result of my correct mental beliefs and surrendered heart. Um, and just I want to drill down practically that, the only thing that's really separating me from my friends who are going to hell is my right knowledge and my right action. Because Jesus died, that's a fact. That doesn't change. So the only difference between me going to heaven and them going to hell is I knew the right things and I did the right thing in terms of inviting Jesus into my heart. So I've got that. That's great. And then so now I'm out of the danger, and now I have access to God. Um, but there's a little asterisk now. There's terms and conditions. Paul says, we see in a glass dimly, and the expectation was that um, you're saved and you know God, but God is still kind of like he doesn't talk to you. It's not quite the full thing that Adam and Eve had. And the primary way you get God's revelation is not personally or directly, it's through prayer and through reading the Bible, um, which I tried to do. But ultimately, I still felt separate from God, and I didn't behave like Jesus. I got in trouble, and that shouldn't be happening. And that just led me back to the beginning of the cycle. Um, so as a kid, I got saved a bunch. And at some point, I just figured I did it enough times that it really must have counted. And then this really became about confession. It was like, I'm right with God, and then I sinned, and now I'm wrong with God, and I got to confess, and then I can be right with God again. And it just goes. Um, and so even though I was on the bridge, I still felt separate from God, and that left me feeling very confused. But I wasn't going to give up. So I went to Christian college. And at Christian college, I was really going to grow my faith. That's what I wanted. I wanted to grow closer to God. I figured I just needed more time to grow up, and Christian college would be the place to do that. And in many ways, it was. I mean, I got exposed to a lot. I think what's most emblematic is there was a group of professors in the Bible and philosophy departments that had adopted a block in the nearby city of Springfield, Ohio. I went to Cedarville University in Ohio. So in Springfield, they adopted this block, and they would go around and just knock on doors, ask people, is there anything we can pray for you? Is there anything we can pray about in your life? And I think like 9 times out of 10, they'd say, yeah, I'm worried about XYZ. Let's pray. And that turned into a church community that met on Saturday nights, which I had never heard of a church meeting on Saturday nights. That blew my mind. They didn't have a pastor. That also seemed crazy. And they had a meal every service. So it was really interesting, really alternative to what I came from, and grew my vision of what faith could be. But by the end of my college experience, my faith was just so stale. And like the funniest image I have is from, at a Christian college or in the cafeteria, everyone's got to bow their head and pretend to pray before they can start eating. And by the time I tried, I did it genuinely in the beginning, but by the time I graduated, it was just put your head down for 10, 15 seconds until you've convinced everyone you prayed, and then dig in. Um, So I go out into the real world. I'm graduated. I'm working as an engineer, and my faith is really on its last legs. Um, and I was reading this book, The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. I didn't know anything about it, just found it on a list of great novels. And the story is about this architect, Howard Rourke, who's a brilliant architect, just has a real integrity to him and a real devotion to his profession. And his architecture is amazing as a result. Um, and the people around him hate him for it because their integrity is not as good. Their architecture is terrible. And so they take him to court. I don't really remember the details, but basically they want to crucify him. And his lawyer says, um, you know, you hate him because you lack integrity. You don't respect yourselves, and you're taking it out on him. And this is a whole problem for humanity. You see, humanity, it's not that God created humanity in God's image. Man created God in man's image as a way to get out of this I don't respect myself situation. And in the story, this lawyer is essentially describing that, for most people, when you look at yourself in the mirror, what's your response? Do you respond with the beloved glowing eyes of Jesus? Does it feel like, I love who I am and I'm so proud of you and you just bring me delight? Or do you want to turn away because there's some shame, some not enoughness? Um, and in the story, the lawyer was saying, because of this dynamic, we invented God. And for me, that just cut to the quick. It really cut me to the core. And it was true for me. I don't know that it's true for everybody, but it was true for me. What I believed about God was an image. It wasn't the real thing. And so as soon as someone pointed that out precisely, it was seen through. And it was very much like when somebody pointed out to me as a kid that Santa Claus wasn't real. I remember distinctly this kid in my church pointed out Santa Claus isn't real. And I was like, yes, oh, wait, immediately just knew, no, Santa Claus isn't real. And so for me, that was very devastating. In one fell swoop, my whole worldview, really my whole life kind of went up in smoke. And I remember that first weekend, I would be like at the grocery store and then just think, oh, wait, God's not real. And it was a real depressing, it was pretty dark. Um, and I felt like I had been kicked out of the kingdom, out of Christendom. Um, again, separated from God. And I talked to some people, I talked with my family, but they weren't going through the same thing. And so they couldn't quite know how to help me. I started reading apologetics, which was not helpful because this was just more ideas about God. It wasn't the real thing. Um, Another key point was I had a roommate who became a really good friend, who was into Buddhism while we were living together. And we would have conversations. And Buddhism sounds super, I could not make sense of it, this whole attachment thing. But I visited a temple and it's an interesting reference point. And where my first glimmer of hope and sort of like making sense of all of this came from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in this movie, there are these monoliths, this black rectangular thing in the middle of the screen that are clearly not part of the natural landscape, but in the movie they catalyze evolution. So in this scene, um, the monkeys are around this monolith and they start picking up sticks and using them as tools. And this is somehow an evolutionary step towards becoming Homo sapiens. And this is from the second part. I don't even remember what this scene was about, but the picture is that something intently put these there for the benefit of those who find them. But there was no trace of this benevolent being. And this gave me this sense of God, not as a person, but as kind of an impersonal force. Um, Growing up, God was always a person that wanted to know me and have a personal relationship with me. And this was different. This was something more infinite. And this really all came together for me when I started meditating. So in 2001, um, I was listening to a podcast with Sam Harris that got me interested in his waking up meditation app and got onto a conversation he had with a teacher called Locke Kelly. Um, so I was listening to their conversation one evening, sitting on my patio here in Brooklyn, and in the middle of the conversation, Sam invites Locke to give a meditation instruction. So I followed along with it. And his instruction was focus on your breath at your belly. I did that. And then he said, and now turn around and look for the focuser. And suddenly I was in my belly and I was in my head. And I thought, how can I be in two places at once? And the whole thing just exploded. And it was a real burning bush kind of moment. Um, I was sitting here and somehow the tree was somehow closer in this instant. I hadn't become the tree. I hadn't moved out of my chair. The tree hadn't moved, but it was somehow closer to me. And language had sort of disappeared. It was like it got put in the trunk of my car. Um, it was this utter silence. and this utter peace. There was this unconditional love and peace. And I remember thinking, well, the most obvious thing was the voice in my head was gone. The voice in the head that's always judging and worrying and planning and strategizing, it was just gone. And I thought, oh, this is what they're talking about. This is why they meditate. I'm free. And it had this quality of realness. It was somehow the most real experience I'd ever had. And I didn't even know that that was something to look for, that there were qualities of realness. Um, and it felt like this is a wood carving from Belgium. It was like breaking through a canopy, but not going anywhere. But somehow the presence of God, is what I refer to it now, was revealed. Um, and it felt like I was everywhere, like I didn't have a limit. And I could see that the presence of God was everywhere, and somehow I was that too. Um, it wasn't that I'm over here and God's over here, and there's a gap that has to be bridged. God was throughout all of it. It wasn't that humanity is over here and God is over here, and that must be bridged. God is present in and as all of it. Um, and from a mindfulness perspective, and we'll be exploring this, the real sense is that I am a thinker, ego. I'm located in my head behind my eyes, and that makes me feel separate from other people, from God, from the world. And that is what it feels like to be cast out of the garden. And through the mindfulness practices I came to learn, you train your awareness to shift out of that locus of head that's always trying to be in control, and you shift into a more embodied sense of being, and that actually doesn't have a limit. Um, and that's the way the presence of God is revealed. And it's direct, it's authoritative, and it's so personal. So for me, the last 4 years, I've really taken to studying this and practicing it. It was what I was looking for, and I sort of couldn't get enough of trying to figure out what it was, even though it doesn't really work that way. And in the last year, I've been able to really take what I've experienced through mindfulness and integrate that with my Christian faith and what I was taught growing up, what Jesus teaches. Um, and really, the experience that I had, I mean, the experience that I had was pretty like fireworksy. A lot of people have it, a lot of people don't. Doesn't really matter. Um, but it was not dissimilar from what happens to Jesus at his baptism. So here we've got John the Baptist on the left, Jesus on the right. He's just been baptized. In the Gospels, the heavens tear open. The presence of God descends like a dove. And then Jesus realizes something profound about his nature and his identity, and the rest is history. Um, and my belief is that what he experienced here at his baptism is what he was teaching, and that was his gospel, that the kingdom of heaven is here, it's within us, it's in our midst. We just don't know how to look. Um, and Jesus uses this metaphor of a seed growing, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's the smallest seed, but when it grows into a tree, it's a mighty tree. And this glimpsing of the presence of God is like that. It kind of infiltrates your being, and it takes its own course of psychological healing and safety. And for me, it has been transformative. I mean, that's why I'm here trying to share it, because it has really like reduced my anxiety, made me feel less afraid of the world, less worried about other people, what other people think, what I think, and enabled me to be more free, more comfortable in my own skin, um, and more grounded in a sense of God's presence and love. And so I say, with all this story, just to say, like, all of it was perfect, and God was in all of it. That's very clear to me now. I think, my parents and my communities growing up tried to do such a good job training us, but ultimately we all have our own mountains to climb. And I don't think that's an accident or a mistake. And God really does come to us in the shape of our life. I think it's that personal. So that's my case study. Hopefully that was not too long with, but hopefully that was useful. And we can maybe draw on it as we move forward. So next week, we're going to look at the human condition and basically get a sense for how the condition of being identified as a separate someone in your head is that experience of being separated from God. And through this awareness practice, we can shift into a more um, connected, not separated, non-separation way of being that is the peace that passes understanding. Okay, so next up, I thought we could dive into a practice, but I guess before we do that, I just figured I'd open it up. Curious if anyone has any comment, anything that my whole story sort of brings up for you that you'd like to share with the group. I hope that this whole thing is very conversational, so please feel free to chime in with whatever, something you liked, something that resonated, question.
I don't
And
really have a question, but just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. And um, I enjoyed the graphics that you chose, and yeah, it was very helpful. So
cool.
thanks.
Yeah, glad to hear that.
I'm curious to know a little bit more about this concept of sin nature. I did not grow up in an evangelical tradition, but in a Lutheran tradition. And so much of what you said seemed very Lutheran, frankly.
Mm,
Um, but you kind of commented that sin nature kind of became a thing in the Western church,
yeah,
but really isn't even part of the Eastern Orthodox way of kind of view. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert, but from the bit of research I've done, there are a few things that Paul says that kind of hint at this quality of sinfulness we find in the world. We really do find it, right?
Hmm.
There are a lot of terrible things. Um, but it's not until Augustine. Augustine was a very influential theologian. I don't remember what century, but it was definitely centuries after Jesus. And my understanding of him is he lived a pretty wild life and then converted. And he gave us a lot of good things, but he also gave us some, I think some of his baggage. And he was really convinced of this sin nature and was really opposed to some more universal idea that in due time everyone finds their way because he felt that wasn't like motivating enough. Um, and so there were other people in the church who disagreed with him. And I don't know the specifics, but it seems that that was the viewpoint that got solidified in the tradition and has affected so many people. Uh, and I'll just say, I think there's something very natural about latching on to an identity of shame. Um, I don't think growing up the way I grew up is the only way. I think there's many different ways, lots and lots and lots of people. It might even be everyone. Um, just by the nature of being born as an individual and growing up and experiencing as a youngster, as a baby, as a child, experiencing moments where your parents didn't come when you cried, these are very traumatic experiences, and our systems, we'll look more at this next week. Our systems create identities of not good enough as ways to cope with these environmental stressors. And so I think there's something like very attractive and sort of welcoming about the idea of a sin nature, because it does, like, yeah, there are times when I feel broken, and so a sin nature makes sense, and that somebody has an answer for that is what I want to hear, and that's healing. um, but for me the problem is, well, God created us good, like, why doesn't it go all the way back? why does it why did the terms and conditions only get us to after the fall? um, And for me, I think that the claim that we are fundamentally good is fairly radical, but I think that's what Jesus taught. Because when you see him interacting with everybody, he's not treating them like they're sinners. He doesn't seem to relate to them like they're sinners. Like the adulterous woman who the Pharisees bring to test Jesus, he solves them and they go away. And then he says, go and sin no more. He doesn't seem to, I like relate to her as someone who needs fixing, who is lack, who is in a deficit. Um, in the Gospels, the Pharisees are the people he gives the hardest time to. And I don't even think he's putting them down or treating them as a sinner. I think the people who feel they have all the answers are the hardest ones to teach, and that's why he treats them the way he treats them. Um, yeah, that's
Thank you.
all right. Very good. All right, well, let's dive into a practice. So the premise here is that God is omnipresent. And so when we practice, we're not actually like doing anything or developing anything, creating anything. We're really more relaxing and ceasing to obscure God's presence, um, for what that's worth. So I'll stop sharing my screen.